Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Jessica Blumenthal, and I'm a director in the Banking and Finance Department at ENS Africa. Today's masterclass is the 12th in our masterclass series, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. If you're joining us for the first time, this series, like those before it, is presented by the Banking and Finance Department to assist those in the financial services sector to obtain CPD hours before the end of the cycle at the end of this month. This year, we are presenting 16 hours of CPD accredited masterclasses, and we're using the opportunity to canvass topics that we believe are of importance to the industry. We've brought together panels of experts to discuss and unpack some of the emerging risks and trends, and we've drawn these experts from the various departments and jurisdictions in which our firm is present. What they all have in common is a commitment to their own continuous learning and to considering how their practice areas are impacted by the rapid and numerous developments in what we can only call for shorthand the ESG space. Before we get into the panel discussion for today, just a few housekeeping points. Those of you who are joining for CPD purposes and who would like a certificate after this masterclass, please bear in mind that we have to verify your attendance, so you do need to stay online for the full hour of the presentation. Your certificate will be sent to you by our team via email within about 3 days after the presentation. Then you would have seen just before we kicked off that we do still have some masterclasses left, 4 to be exact. We've got 1 tomorrow and then 3 next week. So please do join us for those if you still need some hours or if you find the topics interesting. We do have the ability for you to add questions during this session, so you can use the Q&A block at the bottom of your screen for that. Just from experience of the last few panel discussions we've had, we've been struggling to get to questions. So if we aren't able to answer your question during the discussion, then we will reach out to you separately afterwards and address your question. And of course, you can email directly any of my panelists and they'd be happy to engage with you further. And that's also a good idea if you have a specific question relating to your own set of facts. Then finally, if you would like to meet any of the panelists or have an opportunity to really connect in person after all these hours connecting with us over the screen, we will be hosting a cocktail function or a networking function in both our Cape Town and Johannesburg offices. And we invite all of you to join us, can meet the panelists in real life. You can check if they're taller than you expected when you saw them on the screen, and you can ask them any of those questions that you didn't get addressed during the discussion. So I'm going to invite my panelists onto the screen with me now. I'm very happy today to be welcoming Witness Makubele, Shafika Hartley, and Zain Bayat of our Corporate Commercial Department. They are all corporate governance specialists in their own right, all with a slightly different interest area in that space. And as I said, they're all members of the Corporate Commercial Department as well. We know that the requirements of corporate governance are changing. They're being shaped by the regulation, the policy development, and actually also the shift in public sentiment that we've been experiencing. So that means that governance arrangements, frameworks, and policies need to be reactive. They can't be documents set in stone or adopted and then put in a drawer and never looked at again. So Shafika, let's kick off with you. What do you think is the main effect on a company's governance arrangement of the shift from shareholder primacy to stakeholder primacy?
Thank you, Jessica, and good afternoon to everyone joining us today. Jess, I think ultimately what has spurred and continues to drive this movement towards stakeholder primacy is a need or perhaps even a want for greater accountability. That is both the input that is required as well as the desired outcome from a governance perspective. From a stakeholder primacy perspective, it's no longer sufficient for the board to simply manage the business and affairs of the company to maximize profits without being reckless and fraudulent, of course. While that remains an outcome, of course, stakeholder primacy requires of the board to factor into the sustainability, long-term sustainability of the business and its impact on the economy, on the environment, and also the broader society as a whole. And not just that, but also then the impact of those elements on the company. And that is what the King Code on Corporate Governance in the 4th edition refers to as the triple context in which the organization or company operates, being the economy, the environment, and society as a whole. And you're quite right, Jess. Public sentiment has moved on. There's a growing acceptance that some of the greatest challenges facing business today are in fact common global challenges, things such as climate change, environmental degradation, accelerated depletion of natural resources. This requires a shift in corporate strategy. If we are to recognize that companies have a greater role to play in this paradigm, if we are to accept that companies have a greater responsibility to all stakeholders, be it employees, customers, suppliers, lenders, and shareholders, of course. Companies are dependent on and contribute to the context in which they operate. The International Integrated Reporting Council, which was formed just over a decade ago to drive integrated reporting as a norm for businesses, published an international reporting framework, which very simply and profoundly provides, in my view anyway, that the organization's ability to create value for itself, in fact, depends on its ability to create value for others. And I thought that was so succinct in summarizing what it is that we're talking about this morning. Then the King Code includes as a key theme as well in formulating governance principles, the stakeholder inclusive approach. And if we think about it in practical terms here in our country, if we think about transformation initiatives, empowerment of employees, empowerment of communities, and balancing that with shareholder rights, giving away a part of your company, equity in your company, for the greater good. If we think about the just transition, which is on our radar, it's here, but it's not here, it's coming, it's not going away. But to balance that against being socially inclusive and building a resilient economy, these are all the kinds of strategies which will require this very kind of balance that we're talking about now from a stakeholder imperative. And whilst fundamentals may already be in place, the implementation thereof, I think, will be different. And while you don't want to throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater, I think that the governance framework also will need to be looked at. If we take as a simple example, board composition. Companies will already have their board in place in accordance with statutory requirements. Private company, at least 1 board member, public companies, at least 3. If that company is listed or meets certain other requirements, there are legal requirements that you need an audit committee in place, a social and ethics committee in place. And these already introduce enhanced governance requirements. Social and ethics committee needs to guide the board and report to shareholders on a myriad of governance issues. And they're not, just sort of a normal corporate governance Companies Act type things. It's also anti-bribery and corruption. It's labor issues, compliance with consumer relations issues, and not just statutes either. The Companies Act, in fact, says that they need to take into account broader practice guidelines, international best practice. But what I want to, I think, make clear, though, is that these statutory requirements, they are merely the base case almost. They are the fundamentals, really, and we've almost moved on from there. Our own King Code, like many others, prescribe even greater enhancements to corporate governance. And so this is the impact: to better respond to current and future challenges, to better meet the evolving expectations, I think, of stakeholders, and to be successful then within this triple context in which the organization operates. And again, unless you're a public listed company on the JSE, these are voluntary principles. But we're talking about public sentiment, right? About meeting stakeholder expectations. So practically speaking, it's no longer best practice to have as your governance deck your MOI and then a number of charters. We thought that was the gold standard a few years ago. You have a board charter and a number of committees, and each one of them have a charter, and that's your pack. But policy gives effect to strategy. So stakeholders will be looking to see what you have in your deck now. Do you have code of conduct, code of ethics, human rights policy, gender diversity policy, sustainability policies? King, sets out a host of these as recommended practices for institutional investors, stakeholder management policies, for example. I mean, to name a few. So this is likely where we're going to see governance going, I think. And a balanced board, just bringing it back to the practical example of a board, with statutory compliance, the balanced board would at the very least need to comprise directors who, yes, are sufficiently experienced in the assets and business of the company, but also then appropriately skilled to drive the governance agenda going forward. It's no surprise that King then includes as one of its main principles that a governing body must comprise the appropriate balance of knowledge, skills, experience, diversity, and then in discharging its objectives, it needs to have this mix and then discharge its responsibility objectively and effectively, but relying on this kind of balance. And a nice example of making sure that you balance, the experience with the new, fresh ideas is this practice recommended by King, that once a board member reaches the 9-year mark, so you're almost in place for a decade, that individual then needs to be assessed annually from that point going on. And in that way, kind of recommends to you to take stock. And this person's value add is, in the institutional knowledge, but let's see where the strategy is right now. Do we need fresh ideas? Do we need new perspectives? Do we need independence of thought? Let's weigh it against each other. So Jess, you ask, main effect of governance on governance from, the perspective of the shift in sentiment. I think that governance documents will need to adapt to the broader accountability imperative, and that companies therefore need to take stock, within the framework that I've just sketched now. Do they have an appropriate governance structure in place, which is sufficiently agile? Do they have a risk management structure in place that can respond to that? And very importantly, companies then should undertake at least, I think, an annual governance review.
No, thanks, Shafika. And I think you've made that point very, very eloquently. The fact that an annual review is, I think, helpful in ensuring that governance arrangements remain living documents able to agilely respond to this change in sentiment and to the increased demands upon companies to function not in a business as usual way, but in a more inclusive way. So if we think about directors now needing to consider something more than merely the attainment of profits, then of course that must have an impact on the governance structures and the way in which the organization is regulated. And if we think of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 12 encourages companies, especially large transnational companies, to adopt sustainable practices and to integrate sustainability information into their reporting cycle. And in South Africa, you've mentioned King, which obviously is very much perhaps a forerunner in this space. And we also have the JSE Sustainability Disclosure Guidance, encouraging companies to report and disclose through the sustainability narrative disclosures and the core and leadership sustainability metrics that are presented in that disclosure guidance. And of course, that's voluntary. But what does this mean for companies operating in South Africa?
Well, Jess, the thing about broader accountability is that it has to be demonstrated to be truly effective. The point is to account to stakeholders. And so the manner in which you do that is through disclosure. Assume for the moment that the company has undertaken, this review, the refresh, has gone the route of updating its governance framework and preparing what it believes to be a cogent and responsive set of policies. Those policies then need to be acted upon. Stakeholders want to understand the board strategy, how management has implemented the strategy within the enhanced governance framework. And so what that means for South African companies looking to push through in the space now is that they would need to step up their reporting game. Regulators favor increased disclosure. Stakeholders favor increased disclosure. Potential investors would favor increased disclosure. So there's no going back. The question then becomes, what is it that a company needs to disclose? How should they present the information in a meaningful way and to whom? So compliance with legal disclosure requirements would be the starting point, of course. Local and international disclosure guidelines have also been formulated over the years. And these are all works in progress. We're in an evolving space, so they're dynamic, and I have no doubt that they will continue to kind of evolve, and along the way, some of them will no doubt become binding, though, in some shape or form. Companies would, of course, prefer certainty to avoid the unnecessary time and costs of preparing reports which add little value and for the company or the stakeholders. And so they would be looking for benchmarks. And we do certainly have some benchmarks available, unless, again, you're a public listed JSE company. These are voluntary, and they represent, though, in my view, what will become best practice. The more organizations across the board, locally and internationally, adopt these, the more that your basic legal compliance leaves your papers looking very thin and left wanting. And essentially, we're now talking about integrated reporting because that's where we are. That's the space we're in. In this regard, companies would need to be intentional. Reporting should ideally be part of the strategy and will require planning to gather the correct data for purposes of disclosure. It can't be an afterthought at the end. How do we now report, but we don't have the data to fill the report? We've spoken about King Code. This is one of the disclosure and reporting guidelines that we have. It advocates for integrated thinking, which then leads to integrated reporting. And that's across what it refers to as all potential sources of value creation. We spoke about the triple context. There's also the capitals that are employed by businesses. These are not just human capital, but also intellectual capital. There's financial capital and manufacturing capital. So there are a number of those, and the reporting would need to cover across all of them. I think it's important that the reporting must assess both all of the short, medium, and long-term performance of the company, but also against that projected performance, where the company is going, and that needs to be looked at through the lens of sustainability within the context of improved and enhanced governance and reporting. Integrated reporting, in terms of the international reporting framework that I referred to earlier, has a very specific purpose. It says that it's there to explain to financial capital providers how the organization creates, preserves, and erodes value over time. And that integrated reporting is there to demonstrate the link between, on the one hand, strategy, governance, and financial performance of the company, and on the other hand, the context in which it operates. And the reason for doing this is to enable business, on the one hand, once it sees all of this data collated and collected, to make more sustainable decisions going forward, but then also to provide stakeholders with this more holistic picture of the organization, and therefore a more accurate understanding of the performance of the business and then the prospects of the business in this environment in which the business has to operate going forward. And remember, the companies are competing against others. Yes, some are listed, some are subjected to different legal requirements, etc. But over time, we can see even those who are not required legally to comply are stepping up the reporting game and are providing these more sort of enhanced disclosures. We've also mentioned the JSE Sustainability Disclosure Guidance. That's another benchmark. The JSE's guidance is based in and grounded in its belief that sustainability issues are material to enterprise value creation. And in launching the guidelines, the JSE sees itself as a facilitator almost of more transparent and efficient capital markets. And they're also looking at this long term. The guidance is intended to allow stakeholders to better assess the organization's exposure to sustainability issues, but it allows businesses to be tracked against one another in this area on a sort of more level playing field. Because that's what businesses are looking for. What is it that I need to disclose? And you don't want one business to disclose, along one set of principles and another completely different. And then how do you compare the two as an investor, for example? National Treasury has developed a green taxonomy, also geared at standardizing terminology, again, to create a more level playing field. And this is all just about, where do I go? What do I do as a business? This is not law, it's not mandatory, but if you want to enter the green economy, you want to offer such products, you want to play in this space, this is where the organization will find assistance as to best practice and what stakeholders and potential investors or investment partners will be looking for from a disclosure and reporting perspective in order to evaluate whatever corporate opportunity it is that's being presented to them. And again, I think this inevitably will require training and skills development. I don't know that all the organizations can, hand on heart say that they are geared at the moment, and fully ready to respond to this. But there are, resources out there. There's this masterclass, for example, attend the masterclass and learn something, but it needs to filter back into the organization. I think as a starting point, it's a good idea to appoint a sustainability officer or similar person in that role. At least start there. One person mandated to then, investigate these opportunities and potential pitfalls, gaps, and then, that person can be, appropriately trained and then can train internally within the organization as well.
Thanks, Rafika. So, I think what you've sketched really well for us is that this filters through into the strategy of the company, thereby into the governance arrangements of the company. And then we've almost jumped over the operational side and started talking around the reporting and what that means for stakeholders and those interested in the performance of the company. And there, of course, you've touched on the point that it's important to be comparing apples with apples, and hence the need for a level playing field. But Witness, I'm going to ask you to come in here and add for us the middle section. So if we have an improved strategy of the company that takes sustainability into account, and we want to implement that strategy within the business, or the company wants to implement that. I know you've worked with companies around their reporting lines in respect of these issues, and I think it'd be really helpful if you could share with us some of your observations in this regard as to what companies are doing to ensure implementation of those governance arrangements and strategies. Thank you.
Thanks, Jess. Thank you very much, Jess. And good afternoon, everyone. I have seen in a number of instances where companies would set out detailed reporting mechanisms, understanding that the business of the company, in terms of the law, is basically run by the board of directors, but the board is allowed, in terms of the law, to delegate some of those functions and powers and authority to committees. And whilst that is the case, the committees are still required to act within their parameters, within their terms of reference, within the authority that had been given to them by the board. And the board still has oversight role on the activities of the committees. And the reporting lines with regard to that is that the committees in the execution of their powers, their delegated authority, they still have to make sure that they do that in line with what the board had actually given them. They still have to report back to the board, and the board has still to report back to the stakeholders, as Shafika had indicated. The most important part in all of this is that in order to ensure that the reporting lines are not blurred and that the committees know what they need to do and not to do, it is important that there are terms of reference, that there are guidelines, there are governance policies within which the committees would have to operate. And these governance policies need to be very clear in terms of what the authorities are for the various committees, what the responsibilities of the board is going forward. Because we have seen in many instances that sometimes committees believe that because of the fact that they've been given these powers, that they can actually act without necessarily having to report back to the board. And the one most important, interesting part is that where committees have to deal with very strategic matters, there is nothing wrong for committees to go back to the board, even though that those matters are still within the realm and the authority of the committees. And I've seen this in instances where you would find that an investment committee of a company, for example, it's tasked with providing or approving investments, or credit committees, they're tasked to approve certain limits of financial commitments by the company. But they will go back to the board because they believe that certain aspects of what they need to do are so strategic and fundamental to what they need to do that they want that wisdom and that guidelines from the board. So it's very, very important that in undertaking and executing their functions, there is synergies between the board and the committees, and that at any given time that the committees act within the mandate. And for them to be able to act within those mandates, it is important that those mandates are clear and are clearly set out in governance policies. And this in itself will then assist the committees to act with speed and ensure that they comply with their governance and authority. You have seen in the recent review of the policies of a client where we had, those many policies that we had to go through and review, and the extent to which there were some blurring of lines in terms of what that they needed to do and what they couldn't do. And sometimes we find that there were some conflicts between the policies of the various committees. So it's really important that each of these committees and each of the policies that govern the terms of reference of these committees are clear and there is no blurring of lines. Because if you do that, then you're going to have problems, because then the oversight role of the board is going to be hampered by all of these things. The most important thing, and it's something that Shafika touched on, is that at any given time, whatever governance documents have been put in place for purposes of reporting, for purposes of giving the committees, the board, certain mandates, it is important that these are updated and are updated having regard to trends that are going on at any given time. Now we have ESG, which is really an important part of our lives. Then it is important that clients be aware that there are certain requirements that they have to comply with. And if they don't have any of these policies, to set them up. And if they don't have any of these committees, to set them up and to ensure that they are able to comply with their governance requirements. Thanks, Jess.
Thanks, Witness. Absolutely. And I think we've seen that time and time again, that as things evolve and change, these documents and these terms of reference for the committees and even the reporting lines need to change with them. And it all needs to be updated holistically to ensure we don't have the blurring of the lines that you've spoken about, or essentially weakness in the infrastructure, the contractual infrastructure that allows the business to operate efficiently and effectively. And then, I mean, maybe coming to you now, one of the things that perhaps needs to be relooked at in light of this paradigm shift that Shafika sketched at the beginning is the remuneration practices of companies.
Hi, Jess. Yes, thanks. Definitely. I think there's a recognition that remuneration and incentivization drives particular behaviors. And this is where the tire hits the tarmac, so to speak. How do organizations structure their arrangements whereby particular drivers are geared towards particular outcomes? And historically, as you're aware, market practice has always been to trigger remuneration payments and incentivization payments linked to, ignoring the employment aspect, certain performance criteria, both of the individual and the organization. From the organization perspective, it's usually linked, or historically it's been linked to profitability thresholds or earnings thresholds and the like. As we're all aware, sustainability and the circular economy, ESG generally, a more long-term perspective is required of companies. And the question then is, how then do we align particular key employees and management of an organization with the long-term goals? Because again, there's a appreciation that remuneration and incentivization should be driven towards particular behavior. We need to encourage particular behaviors designed to take the longer term, more strategic, sustainable outcomes of an organization, and how best to address those. There has been a number of views expressed that the traditional approach to remuneration practices and incentivization just does not cut it. It's too narrow, it's too short term. It only speaks to the financial outcomes, doesn't speak to the others. And the practice, particularly now in the new ESG environment, is to align the historic practices with the current requirements, to better remove those actual or perceived conflicts of interest between what's in the short-term incentive of the manager versus the long-term incentive or drivers for the corporation to remain profitable, to remain in existence for as long a period of time as possible. And that requires, to my mind, a bit of a carrot and stick approach. Carrot, aligning payments with particular outcomes linked to ESG goals, and the stick, disincentives for driving or gearing management to avoid particular practices in order to manage those competing interests, in order to drive the particular behaviors that we're looking for, and also to align with the broader audience out there as to what it is that they're looking for. So by way of example, we've seen companies looking for measurement or evaluation of particular emissions of a particular organization, whether they've reached particular goals towards the zero rating or reducing of gas house emissions, reducing of paper consumption, those sort of things. Tangible, measurable outcomes in order to measure effectively the efficacy and performance, not just of a financial nature of a particular organization. Carbon emissions could be measured, measuring the company's contribution to broader social outcomes and the like. And by the same token, penalties could be inserted in order to be evaluated by a remuneration committee as to whether or not particular conduct is avoided, the contra of what I've just discussed. And overall, I suppose that the wider audience and broader stakeholder management are speaking to exactly these issues. So by way of example, it's not just my word. The Investment Association, it's the Institutional Shareholder Services and other interested industry bodies, if I can put it that way, stakeholder management organizations geared towards governance and shareholder interests, all speak to ESG metrics being something that should be incorporated in an organization's remuneration policy. It should be linked to specific tangible value creation, sustainable goals, linked to the particular industry sector of an organization, and capable of being communicated to stakeholders in a manner that they can understand and appreciate, and enhances the evaluation or objective evaluation of those sort of criteria. From a South African perspective, there's been very few companies that speak to those on a transparent level in the listed space. They do exist internationally. And we've also seen this not just in the listed space, they also exist in the private equity space, where either from particular development finance institutions or generally, where they're looking for more transparent reporting criteria, speaking to exactly these sort of goals. So the short answer is definitely that there is a need for this to be incorporated in remuneration policies, but there are still some questions. What are the specific goals? How do we effectively manage them? Is it sufficiently objective? Who's got the expertise to advise remuneration committees, etc.? But I think we're on the right path. We're not there yet, but we're getting there.
Absolutely. And I think that that alignment of remuneration practices and that incentivization of management in line with KPIs linked to the strategy that's been set by the board to pursue a more sustainable business is very important. And it's an important part of the guardrails, similar to what Witness was touching on in light of the terms of reference and how reporting lines in terms of reference are so important to ensure functioning in accordance with the governance arrangements. So too are remuneration practices and their alignment with the strategy and the outcomes sought by the business. Similarly important to get proper outcomes of integrity from the business. So Witness, maybe coming back then round to you. In addition, so we've spoken about the remuneration practices and that being another area that companies may like to relook at when they think about what they should change in their governance arrangements right now. Perhaps another thing, and Shafiq has touched on the necessity to relook at the board and ensure that there's diversity and independence on the board, to ensure that there's robust decision-making that can really take into account the impact of the organization within this new paradigm. But I guess a related issue for boards is how they deal with conflicts of interest. because that goes as well to good decision-making at board level. So could you share some observations with us from your practice? Would you say that management of conflict of interest now requires a more substantive approach than perhaps it did a few years ago?
Thanks, Jess. No, certainly does. The law, the Companies Act, provides some mechanism, probably at a high level, of how conflicts of interest can be dealt with. The manner in which is provided for in terms of the Companies Act seems to be slightly more focused on directors' interest in the financial interest in contracts, right? And one would have expected that to be slightly broader than just that, given the fact that in many instances there could be interests that are not necessarily of financial nature that the board or any director may have in relation to whatever that the company may be doing. And to the extent that you don't have those details as set out in the MOI, which is really the constitution that is binding the company and its board members, it is important then to have a policy that's obviously consistent with the law, but expands the law a little bit to set out the manner in which conflicts of interest can be dealt with, right? And I'll give you an example. We're advising a UK-based entity, which is setting up shop here in SA. And when we prepared the document for them, they looked at it and then they felt it was actually very thin. Interestingly, the UK Companies Act has a slightly much more detailed and broader terms dealing with conflicts of interest, which they basically expand just more than financial interest in contracts. And I found that to be quite interesting because as a sole shareholder, which is going to be appointing directors, they were quite worried about the extent to which their directors may have other interests outside of just contract that basically may create conflicts within the business, right? And it's one of those things that one sees quite oftenly, that without a broad, detailed policy that deals with conflicts, you may find yourself having difficulties in dealing with conflicts because what we have as the law is not as broad enough to deal with all other facets of conflicts that we face on a day-to-day basis. So it's really important that we unfortunately we get to learn these things as we face them each day, and we then find ways of dealing with them. But it's really important to look at conflicts of interest over a period of time and deal with them. Another example that we came across, and this was a little bit of a problem because we advising a client which has interests, SA-based listed entity which has interest in another entity which is in another jurisdiction, and it's two shareholders. The other shareholder, which is a minority, is a direct competitor with the subsidiary. And the problem is the subsidiary has difficulties in sharing information with the board because in that board of the subsidiary, there are members or nominees of the competitor. But the problem is dealing with how to deal with conflicts there, right? But the biggest problem, and it's something that Shafika touched on earlier on, regarding disclosures and making sure that you are able to deal with your obligations to disclose to the JSE your financial interest and other interests regarding the performance of the subsidiary, then it creates a problem, right? Because the subsidiary says we are not able to disclose as much information to board members and to board shareholders because this other shareholder is going to get this information, and then this information is proprietary to us, and that creates a problem. And you then need to look at how best can we deal with issues like this. And one of if this was an SA entity, we could find a way of putting together a policy that would apply to the board members of that subsidiary, where those who are conflicted shouldn't actually get that information. But the law elsewhere, it's slightly difficult and different, right? But the only problem is because our client is not able to get information, then it has difficulties in complying with the disclosure requirements, as Shafika has dealt with earlier on. So without proper mechanisms of dealing with conflicts, it becomes a problem for board to deal with conflict issues, And remember, we only look at conflicts largely at board level, whereas there are other employees and other people within the organization that may be conflicted. And it's important that those people, they don't necessarily have to be prescribed officers. There may be senior people who are not necessarily prescribed officers. Then it is important that the policy that deals with the conflict should include those people who have some influence on the manner in which the business is run, and they may be conflicted. So it is indeed important that conflict issues are properly dealt with.
Thank you. And I mean, I think a good management system of conflicts will lead to better decisions made at the organization level. And of course, we know that that's one of the major underpins of good governance in an organization is good, robust, non-conflicted decision-making. That's the best defense any company can have against allegations of bad corporate governance or corruption or any other sort of bad behavior on the company's part. So we've been talking about the need for the governance framework, the remuneration practices, the various policies, conflicts particularly, the strategy. We've been talking about all of these different documents or key founding documents of the company and the need for them to all be informed by the impact that the company can have on people, the environment, and the economy. But what is the role of the lawyer or the advisor to the company in all of this? And so in closing, I'd really just like to give each of my panelists an opportunity to briefly share their thoughts on what the role is for advisors like ourselves to companies, to assist companies on this journey. Shafika, shall we kick off with you?
Sure, Jess. I think that corporate governance really, I mean, at the heart of it, it's a legal imperative still at the end of the day. I've spoken about voluntary international best practices and codes and guidelines, but there are certain fundamental legal obligations that must be met. And organizations would need to be careful not to replace the entire governance structure with one that just follows, international guideline, for example, because they may fall short then of legal compliance. And so I think that lawyers play a role throughout the life cycle of good corporate citizenship and are able to provide curated and specific advice on governance issues, but can also sort of hold your hand from the start of the governance journey all the way through, from advising on formulation of governance policies, the charters that witness refer to, the rules, the formation of committees, the terms of reference to ensure alignment with legal and regulatory requirements and good governance principles. Also to assist with annual reviews, updating policies annually to an enhanced, evolved governance best practice as well, but maintaining that compliance element. Lawyers assist with annual reporting decks, notices of meetings, resolutions, integrated reporting, the supporting reports that are increasingly now being prepared, ESG related reports and the like. Lawyers can offer assistance with the training that I mentioned, the upskilling of the sustainability officer, the legal team, the risk and compliance team, the board, offering general or bespoke and tailored information or training sessions as required. Most law firms offer, alerts, seminars, newsletters, ongoing skills development. I think that's something important. I think lawyers are able to provide legal opinions on particular governance issues from time to time, and there may be specific queries that arise. Witness reference the conflict of interest, for example. Within the sustainability and ESG framework, what are the new issues that might arise? Things that lawyers might have seen in assisting other clients, and they might be able to then assist more broadly after that. And then the advantage, of course, of partnering with a larger law firm, such as ENS Africa, is the ability to draw on that multidisciplinary set of expertise to maximize coverage. So we would have environmental specialists, we would have natural resources specialists, we would have a forensics team, to assist with anti-bribery and corruption policies, etc. So I think there's a large role where lawyers can support companies in their governance journey. And
I think the point you've made around curated content is quite important. Certainly in our experience of trying to partner with clients and walk this road with them as they update strategy, governance docs, etc., it's the overwhelming nature of all of the developments in this space, particularly when you take into account the international best practice, those which are not mandatory, so not hard law. Trying to get on top of all of those requirements and what it means for a business is quite a task, and I do think that there is a role for curation there. Witness, what would you like to add?
So, and I agree 100% with what Chafika was saying. And just to add to that, and having seen what I've seen through the process of governance and policies, the one key part that lawyers play is to assist with the benchmarking, and the benchmarking comes in different guises, and there's the part that lawyers can obviously do because of their experience having advised various clients in various sectors with regards to governance and policy issues. And then there's the benchmarking because of their relationships that they have with other clients. They may not necessarily have done stuff that relates to that, but they can be able to then check with the other clients, how have they done certain aspects of governance. And you remember just with the project that we just analyzed for a client last year, benchmarking was central to what they wanted to do, because what they had looked at what their business was all about, and just to see whether and what other companies which are doing the same business as theirs are doing, because they were not too sure whether they really are up to date with what the market is up to. And I'm not saying that it's easier for us to do it, but we have slightly much more access to various people from various sectors because we are advising clients from various sectors. And the other important aspect, which I think we are able to add value to the client because of our experience and expertise, is having dealings with international firms, which we have very close relationships with. It's easy for us to then check with them what the trends are internationally and be able to advise. The whole aspect of the fact that we are an SA company, therefore we're only going to comply with an SA requirement is there and thereabout, but things change, and everyone really is going international and global. So it's really important to ensure that you look at what the international trends are and ensure that you comply with those trends. Interestingly, particularly if you look at in the banking sector, where just recently, probably not banking sector, but banking regulatory, recently the government had just passed the amendments to the FICA Act, which requires a whole lot of new training to understand what the requirements are, and the preparation of documents where, for example, you have to have forms that have to be completed when you onboard clients, stuff that were never done or were never required to be done by certain types of businesses are now required to be done by those businesses. And without having people who are experts and specialists in this field, you won't know that you're actually required to comply with that piece of legislation. So it is indeed important to have people who have expertise and can be able to assist you with this type of requirements. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I think that your FICA example is a good one. You know, as companies who were not previously accountable institutions were brought into that fold, that does change the requirements on the company, and that obviously has a ripple effect on the governance arrangements of the company. And thinking about the globalization point, you know, that's true. One can't, as a South African company, only look at South African mandatory hard law anymore. Things like the EU Green Deal will have a profound effect on the way that South African companies who trade with Europe operate. And a quick advert for the session tomorrow, we'll be talking about that with two of our experts tomorrow for those who are interested. Zane, we're going to end with you so you can wrap up our discussion today with your thoughts on this point.
Thanks, Jess. And to echo what we've all said thus far, if anyone has not appreciated to date, ESG and the law is complicated. It's complex, it's multifaceted, and requires understanding. And that's what we lawyers and other advisors do. We try and make the complex understandable and simple. And I think that's what lawyers ought to do best. And I suppose, to put it crudely, we also problem identifiers, risk identifiers, and as an ENS Africa speciality, we problem solvers. So we risk mitigators, and that's fundamentally important to persons holding responsibility, your directors, your prescribed officers, and the like. Come to us, we will help you identify the issues, navigate the complexities that face you, and we're there to cover your behind, to put it crudely. The Companies Act speaks to that specifically by referencing principles such as the business judgment principle, which directors and other fiduciaries can rely on, i.e., someone told me, I sought professional advice, I'm now comfortable, I can rely on it. It absolves you of responsibility. And because lawyers understand the law, we understand the complexities and make it simple for you to understand, we make your journey that much more palatable, easier to follow. And as witness mentioned, we've got expertise insofar as benchmarking or understanding how others in your particular position have accommodated or addressed particular issues, face particular problems. We've got the practical understanding of what it means for you to operate your business. That's what we're there for. We're business support, trying to make your life a bit easier. This is what we do on a daily basis, regulatory advice, understanding. So in short, in order for you to have an integrated, sustainable operation, you need to get professional input, but not just any professional input that is correct, appropriate, and practical, suitable to your particular instance. I'll leave it there, Jess.
Thanks, Zane. And I think the difficulty that companies face in this rapidly changing world that we currently find ourselves in is that, at the beginning of this session, I was talking about ESG as a shorthand term to catch a whole basket of things. And we know that under that banner, there are all sorts of factors that need to be taken into account from a company's perspective, whether they be environmental, social, or governance factors. And you've mentioned the risk and the role of lawyers in helping companies to manage that risk, and equally the role of different committees or organizations within the company itself in managing that risk. But there are also opportunities to be identified and pursued in this changing world. And I think that there's also a role in helping businesses to adapt their strategies, their corporate governance arrangements, as we've talked about, to both manage those risks, manage their impact, and take advantage of the opportunities that lie before them as they get ready to do business beyond business as usual and into the new world that we're essentially on the threshold of. So absolutely, I think it's been all of our experience in our different dealings with our different clients that there is a need for that kind of walking alongside, I guess, and assisting in that way. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank all our panelists, or all my panelists. Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your practical experience as well as your insights on the various questions that I posed to you. Thank you very much. And thank you to our attendees for being with us today. There was one question earlier, I just want to take this opportunity to answer. The question was whether the recording of this session will be available. And the answer to that is yes, it will. We are collating the recordings of all the masterclasses that we have presented. And as an attendee, you will have access to those recordings. They should be available in the coming days, and they'll be shared with you by the team. The one thing just to note on that is that obviously watching the recording will not result in a CPD certificate, but you will have the benefit of the discussion. And then just a question again that's come in about the certificate for attendance and how one can access that. What we do is at the end of this session, our team receives the verification logs that show that you've been online. And then if you requested a certificate when you registered to attend, one will be sent to you on your email address that you added in your registration. If you have any problems, you can contact the events team. Their email address is events@ensafrica.com. I think it is in all of the material that you would have received as well. So yes, they can assist you with that. And then finally, I don't see any other questions coming through. So thank you very much. There is another session tomorrow for those who are interested, touching on the EU Green Deal, as I mentioned a bit earlier, and the impact of that on businesses who are South African or African based, but who have trade relations or trade relations with Europe, and the impact of that European legislation on those businesses. And Mansoor Parker, one of our tax specialists, will also be talking about CBAM, which is the cross-border adjustment mechanism for carbon tax. Again, very relevant to businesses in South Africa doing business with Europe. So we'll unpack that tomorrow. And then next week, we have the final 3 sessions. We will be looking at some BE aspects. So what are some of the emerging things to watch from a BE legislation perspective. We will also be looking at biodiversity and biodiversity credits and offsets and what that means for first of all, what that means and what that can mean for the financial services sector. And then we will have one of our colleagues from our Namibian office who has been working very closely on green hydrogen, talking about green hydrogen and the experiences from the Namibian example. And what those can mean for those interested in green hydrogen in South Africa. So some very exciting sessions left, some very informative sessions. And as I said, it's not too late to register if you've not already done so. So thank you very much. And we hope to meet you at one of our networking functions in either Cape Town or Joburg. Please do RSVP for those if you can join us. Thank you very much. Goodbye.